Hi everybody. Going to give the final video of the week. Sorry, there's a lot of lecture videos this week, but a fair amount of material to get through. Just want to talk a little bit about science and the Enlightenment in the early modern period, and just to sort of cover a few themes that get covered in the textbook. This is just a few things I want to highlight alongside of it. One thing is a lot of this is going to be about looking back at the medieval backgrounds to these things again, sort of pushing back to earlier phases in time to understand where these changes are coming from. One thing you may observe as you're sort of looking at the major scientific developments going on in the early modern period is that a lot of it starts from astronomy. People like Copernicus and Galileo, particularly the issue of whether the Earth goes around the sun or vice versa. And may raise the question, why astronomy? Why of all sciences that the area where this is really taking hold? And the answer to that is that it's built into the nature of the medieval educational system. In the medieval university in Europe, the curriculum was built around what they called the seven liberal arts. And of those liberal arts, you had grammar, rhetoric, logic, basically what they call dialectic. You had mathematics, astronomy, geometry, and music. And of those, astronomy was the only one that was really corresponded to what we would call a physical science, based on observation of the world around. Now, in the medieval university, the teaching of astronomy and the study of astronomy was based on the system of Ptolemy, who was a sort of Greco-Egyptian astronomer who had lived back in the days, of the Roman Empire, some 12 or 1300 years earlier. In Ptolemy's vision, the Earth is a sphere at the center of the universe. Remember, it is a sphere. We saw with Columbus, he was not the guy who first figured out that the Earth is a sphere. People have known that for a long time. The Earth is a sphere at the center of the universe, and then the other celestial bodies, the moon, the sun, the planets, what they call the fixed stars, are a succession of spheres outside of the Earth, surrounding the Earth. Each of the observable entities like the moon is not all by itself floating in space, but it's kind of embedded in a transparent crystal sphere, right? You can sort of see the one solid object or the one, opaque object like the moon, kind of like the jewel in a ring, but there's a whole invisible crystal sphere around it, and these crystal spheres are all nested inside each other like Russian dolls. And as they all spin around, we see the bodies move across the sky, and actually the crystal kind of hums and sings, kind of like a fancy crystal glass at a restaurant, so that there's always this beautiful harmonious music getting generated by the universe as it moves. What they call the music of the spheres, if you've ever heard that phrase. That's what it refers to. The problem with Ptolemy's universe was the planets. In fact, the word planet in Greek means the wanderers. And the problem with the planets is that whereas the stars and the sun and the moon move in a nice smooth curve across the sky, moving in a straight line, the way you would expect them to, the planets move around. They sort of zigzag back and forth and, backtrack on themselves and do all this kind of thing. They sort of move around in a pattern that doesn't really seem to make sense if they were embedded in spheres spinning around the Earth. And so for centuries, astronomers have tried to figure out how do you go about explaining why the planets don't move in straight lines the way everything else does. A solution had been actually proposed by a Muslim astronomer back in the 1200s or 1300s who had suggested that maybe actually the Earth is not at the center of the universe, maybe the sun was, and that would account for the strange movement of the planets. But he hadn't really been able to work out the idea in detail, and nobody really paid much attention to it or followed through on the idea. Then, in the early 1500s, Copernicus, Polish astronomer from Europe, comes along and proposes an alternative, basically proposes the same solution, but Copernicus does a mind-numbing amount of work in his study doing the math. And he sort of is taking the reported observations of the positions of planets, doing all this very complicated geometrical work, and winds up coming up with a lot of math arguing that actually that's what's going on. The sun is at the center of the universe, not the Earth. The Earth is actually moving around the sun, and the strange movement of the planets can be best explained by their positions relative to the Earth as everything goes around the sun. This was controversial. People argued back and forth about it. It was all really just based on the math, and so although there was controversy, nobody really saw there being terribly high stakes, or nobody's condemning anybody or anything like that over it. People think it's a strange and weird idea, but that's kind of as far as it goes. Galileo comes along about 50, 60 years later, and Galileo is going to take new observations with a new bit of technology, the telescope. Galileo never really takes observations that prove the Earth is going around the sun, but he does take observations which continue the process of undermining confidence in Ptolemy. So, for example, when he looks at the moon, he finds that the moon is not a perfect crystal sphere, or perfect spherical body up there in a crystal sphere. It's got mountains, it's got valleys. It's not all that different from the Earth, really. It's kind of irregular, and therefore maybe it's not in a separate category from the Earth, but maybe it's a similar kind of an object. He looks at the sun, which is supposed to be the sort of perfect sphere of light in the Greek philosophical and in the Christian view at the time, and finds that it's got sunspots moving across it, right? It too has these irregularities and imperfections, which kind of remind people of the mortal Earth down here at the bottom of the universe. Most revealingly, he looks at Jupiter, and he notices these dots lined up along with Jupiter that keep on shifting their positions to either side of the planet Jupiter, and then he realizes these are moons. Jupiter has satellites of its own circling around it. The Earth is not unique in having a moon or objects orbiting it. Jupiter also has some, so maybe the sun could. Maybe this sort of shakes up the whole idea of what the order is and what orbits what. So Galileo brings all this forward and supports Copernicus. Now, here's the thing which is most often misrepresented and misunderstood about this sort of new scientific theory of heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth goes around the sun rather than vice versa. Copernicus had patrons and supporters among influential churchmen. Okay, there were a lot of church people who thought Copernicus was great. Copernicus was onto something. Copernicus was really, doing a great job advancing knowledge. Galileo did too. There was a major faction of churchmen, including the guy who became Pope, who were very interested in Galileo's work, thought it was very interesting, very intriguing, moving things forward, were very happy to support it. Okay? What happened in Galileo's case was he ran afoul of some church politics. Okay? In the course of the struggles against Protestantism, you had a faction within the papal court which were sort of on the lookout for heresies. Kind of, there's a lot of anxiety over Protestantism, over the idea of heresy coming along and, attacking the church and taking lands away from the church. And so you sort of got this new group of influential people in high church circles who were making their careers on being the guys who would sniff out the heretics. Okay? And so they were sort of over-eager to go find anything else that might possibly smack of heresy. Galileo falls afoul of this group of people. Okay? So what's happening is not that the church is against science, or even the church is against Galileo, but rather Galileo is caught in the middle of a power struggle within the church itself, with churchmen on both sides of it. Okay, that's an important thing to bear in mind here. As it happens in this particular case, basically because of the individuals involved, and because of the paranoia over Protestantism, Galileo's enemies wind up characterizing him as attacking the Bible, as attacking church tradition, and Galileo himself is kind of a bit of a bull in the china shop sort of personality, can't compromise or moderate himself, his comments very well, insists on publishing things that are a little too controversial for people, and so you wind up with Galileo getting dragged into a church court and getting made to recant his writings and burn his books. So it's important to kind of have this myth grow up around Galileo of sort of, religion against science. Not really true. Lots of religious people very happy to support Galileo. His own daughter was a nun. He was a strong supporter of her nunnery and was a person who supported religion. He did not see his science as contradicting religion. It was just that, like I say, one particular faction got the upper hand and sort of made him its guinea pig, or its sacrificial victim, its scapegoat. The other thing to bear in mind with all this, too, is that the Ptolemaic universe is not the universe in the Bible. In fact, the text, if you look at the Bible literally, the way it describes the universe is basically a flat disk held up by pillars with sort of floating on a gigantic sea of water, and then a big dome over it with water on the other side held back by the dome, right? That's why the sky is blue in the Hebrew Bible. That's, how the flood happens, is God sort of opens up the floodgates of heaven and all this water comes pouring through these sort of gates in the dome over the earth, which is not the Ptolemaic universe, right? So it's something else to bear in mind here, is that actually when you look at the rule of religion here, Christian authorities had bent over backwards and interpreted the Bible in a more symbolic kind of a way, or more metaphorical kind of a way, in order to accommodate it to the best science they had available, which was the Ptolemaic universe for 1,000 years. It's only the particular situation of the 16th century where you have people not willing to go along with a new sort of Galilean view of the universe winding up attacking it. Okay, this does have an impact on science for the future. Something that you're going to see is with the aftermath of Galileo's trial, there's a bit more caution in a lot of the more Catholic countries like Italy and Spain about pursuing potentially controversial scientific research. Doesn't stop, but it slows down. And in the meantime, in Protestant countries, places like the Netherlands and Denmark and England, sort of pursuing cutting-edge scientific research almost becomes kind of a Protestant badge of honor. We Protestants are not those Catholics who persecuted Galileo. We love science. And in the Protestant world, scientists, astronomers, physicists kind of become rock stars. They become these celebrities that are going to really be sort of looked up to and widely admired and sort of put forward as the sort of ideal, Renaissance man, or sort of ideal heroes of the New Age that are coming in. The ultimate example of that would be Sir Isaac Newton in England, who is just, people are in awe of him. He's got fan clubs practically. People just totally admiring Isaac Newton, who's active in the 1670s, 1680s, 1690s. Terribly high status kind of a figure for the Protestant world. Okay, so that's sort of a few thoughts on science. I'm not trying to do a comprehensive view of the development of early modern science, just give you a bit of my take on what's going on some of the key issues here. The other thing is thinking about the Enlightenment, which is also covered in the latter chapter that you had to read for this week. So again, I'm not going to worry about trying to explain the Enlightenment overall. The key word for the Enlightenment is reason, right? What the Enlightenment thinkers are all about is the idea that human reason on its own is able to figure out anything that's worth figuring out, okay? So reason, rationality, the use of human reason is the way you want to tackle any particular problem or question or kind of issue, not authority, not tradition, not revelation or scripture or anything like that, right? The human reason, people just thinking things through on their own, independently of the past, independently of the tradition, independently of authorities of any kind. Thinking in terms of knowledge-making progress rather than trying to learn and preserve the knowledge of the past. Okay, that's kind of the Enlightenment approach to things. It's drawing on a couple of different directions, or sort of coming from a couple of different directions, a couple of different things are setting it up. One area is the precisely these developments in science we've been talking about. As you've had Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and these other great scientists of the 16th and 17th centuries coming up with all these amazing discoveries, and these discoveries get published thanks to the printing press and get to be widely known, it creates an overall attitude, kind of a culture among educated people saying, look, these guys, using their reason, were able to make all these amazing discoveries, come up with all these amazing new theories. Look what human reason can do. If they were able to do that in astronomy or physics, what other areas can we come up with new ideas, new theories, new insights in by using our pure human reason in those areas as well, right? We start thinking about metaphysics. We can start thinking about religion. We can start thinking about morality. We can start thinking about politics and political philosophy, not on the basis of tradition or the inherited situation or the authority of the past, but on the basis of thinking it all through from scratch, just using our unassisted reason. So there's that coming out of the scientific direction. The other thing is the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation we've been talking about. The Protestant Reformation had set off very long, fierce, raging debates between Protestants and Catholics over all sorts of issues, and those arguments had never been resolved, so to speak. Protestant countries were still Protestant, Catholic countries were still Catholic. The theological arguments had never led to any kind of a conclusion that everybody could agree on. The two sides could not agree on how to interpret the Bible or on how to, how much authority to give to church tradition. And so while the Protestants had sort of attacked the idea of church authority and church tradition and set the Bible over against that as the guide to move forward and understand the truth, their inability to prevail with all that, the endurance of Catholicism, in turn kind of undermined them in some sense, again in the eyes of sort of intellectuals in Europe, or at least a certain intellectual subculture, which means that you have people starting to say, well, maybe neither tradition nor church authority nor the Bible, none of this is going to be our guide. None of this is really proven very satisfactory. Maybe we should look for something else, and that something else turns out to be human reason. In particular, also the social chaos that happened in some situations, the persecutions that broke out, the religious wars that took place, like the civil wars in France, wars of religion taking place in Germany. These also led a lot of intellectuals to say, maybe we are having an awful lot of bloodshed over nothing. Now, all those wars really had other reasons besides just religion. But it was easy to sort of tag them as religious wars and say, maybe we should not be fighting over this stuff. Maybe what we ought to be doing is looking for something else. And I thought that maybe if we build a new society based exclusively on human reason rather than religion, maybe that'll lead to everybody agreeing with each other and we'll have peace and harmony in an orderly, just society. Now, that was a little bit overly optimistic, but it sort of reflects the change in mood that you have with Enlightenment thinkers. Okay, the other thing, now a lot of the sort of particulars of the Enlightenment are covered in the textbook. I'd like to particularly stress the Enlightenment is not really a philosophy or even a set of philosophies. There's no one idea other than the supremacy of reason that all Enlightenment thinkers have in common. It's really more of a culture, right? It's sort of a way of arguing, a way of approaching a question, a sort of Enlightenment approach here. So it's not a philosophy, it's sort of a culture of philosophers who are agreeing on the idea they're going to use human reason to tackle questions, even though they're not going to agree on where human reason actually winds up leading. Enlightenment is kind of what's happening in the salons for the upper class and the coffee shops for the middle class, sort of as these new ideas are being spread and discussed about, sort of setting the rules for the game, the rules for discussion that people are using to talk about their ideas. So that's a feature of the Enlightenment. The other thing, which I don't think the textbook really drew as much attention to, which I think is important to bear in mind, is that there is a whole countercurrent. All this Enlightenment and this challenging of religious authority, in many respects, is very much part of an intellectual subculture which embraces a minority of the total population. Very influential minority. These are very educated, influential people. But it's not the entire society. It's not even all educated people. There is another side going on which you need to bear in mind, and it's an area represented by what at least one historian has called the religion of the heart. In other words, what you're seeing through the same period of enlightenment, the 1600s and 1700s, is a countervailing tendency within religious circles of starting to stress not so much the intellectual content of theology, right? Not so much the stuff that the Protestants and Catholics have been arguing about, but rather arguing instead that the essence of religion is in its emotional and moral content, okay? That what religion is really about is not so much, observing and believing in this or that doctrine. These people do believe in the doctrines, but they're saying that's not all that religion is. It's not just about believing in the statement of faith or confession that your church has put out. It's not just about observing the rituals and going to church on Sunday and doing these things, but rather real Christianity, real religion ought to entail a personal, emotional connection to your faith. Okay? That's sort of, it's not coming out the blue. There had been stuff like this beforehand, but it's a new kind of an emphasis and new way of formulating it. And then particularly the idea that this ought to morally transform a person and lead them to go out and do good works in society. In the Protestant world, this movement is called pietism. In the Catholic world, the main equivalent, there's sort of a number of different movements. The main one is called Jansenism. But this idea of a religion of the heart, which is not challenging religious authorities or breaking away from religious authorities. It's not denying traditional religious doctrines, but it's saying given your adherence to traditional religious doctrines and institutions and rituals, what you really ought to be doing is cultivating this religion of the heart. Okay, the sort of emotional and morally engaged form of religiosity. So the pietists will be doing a couple of different kinds of things. One, they tend to sort of form groups within their religious institutions, sort of voluntary groups that will meet together, sort of home meetings. They call them conventicles. They'll sort of meet together for discussion and studying their Bibles and for prayer and, confessing sins to one another, this kind of a thing, and to sort of urge one another on to moral reform and good works and, love for their neighbor and this kind of a thing. They will also often then organize this into charitable kinds of activities, sort of activities to feed and clothe the poor. They'll set up schools and orphanages and institutions like that in order to sort of translate their religiosity into moral works for the good of the society around them. So this pietistic angle is a whole other dimension, kind of really running counter to the Enlightenment. It's kind of the counterpoint to the Enlightenment that's going on at the same time in a different subculture of people, probably actually larger subculture than the Enlightenment subculture in some ways, and probably equally influential, if not more so. It's really a field which is having quite a bit of impact on a broader sector of society in a number of ways, although the pietist element tends not to be very politicized the way the Enlightenment will become. So you're not going to see pietists necessarily launching new political philosophies and revolutions, much more sort of individually, sort of voluntaristically oriented rather than, thinking in terms of reforming government or things like that. Okay, so those are just a few things I want to draw attention to. So development of science, somewhat more complicated relationship to religion in the past than what you've had beforehand. The Enlightenment coming along, reacting to the religious divisions, and sort of encouraged by the success of science and its implications for the powers of human reason, and then countering the Enlightenment, another trend going on towards pietism, towards this heart-oriented religiosity, which is also being very influential for a lot of people in European society. Okay, and I will stop there. Thank you very much. See you on the discussion boards.